Imagine stepping into a medieval courtroom. The candles are burning low, shadows flicker on cold stone walls, and the smell of incense hangs heavy in the air. Clergy in ornate robes sit silently, their faces pale and tense. At the front of the hall, a pope in full regalia sits on a throne, glaring furiously at the accused. So far, this sounds ordinary enough for medieval Europe. But then your eyes drift to the figure on trial. The accused is not speaking. He cannot speak. He cannot even move. Because the accused is very much dead. Dressed in papal vestments, stiff and rotting, the corpse of Pope Formosus sits propped up in a chair before the court. His hands are blackened with decay, his head lolls slightly to one side, and his mouth gapes open as if caught mid-scream. And yet, despite being a corpse, he is about to stand trial for crimes against the Church. Yes, this really happened. This was the Cadaver Synod of 897 AD, when Pope Stephen VI dragged the rotting body of his predecessor out of its grave, dressed it up, and screamed accusations at it in front of horrified cardinals and bishops. It sounds like satire. It sounds like Monty Python. But no, it was deadly serious. The corpse of Pope Formosus was charged with perjury, with breaking canon law, with illegally taking power he should never have had. And Pope Stephen VI wasn't content to simply rant about his dead rival. He insisted on a full trial, with witnesses, evidence, and even a deacon appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse. Picture that for a moment. Somewhere in this nightmare courtroom, a nervous deacon has been ordered to answer questions for a rotting body. Pope Stephen shouts, "Did you unlawfully seize the papacy? Did you betray the laws of the Church?" And the deacon, sweating under his robes, stammers out, "Yes, Your Holiness." The scene is grotesque, but it is also darkly hilarious. And it tells us a lot about how bizarre, brutal, and politically chaotic the medieval papacy could be. But before we dive deeper into this grim farce, let's pause and set the stage. Because the question you might be asking is, why? Why on earth would a pope, the supposed moral leader of Christendom, put a corpse on trial? To answer that, we need to understand the chaos of 9th century Rome. This was not the powerful papacy of later centuries, commanding kings and crowning emperors. This was a papacy racked by factionalism, intrigue, and violence. Roman noble families clawed for influence over the throne of St. Peter. Alliances shifted constantly, and popes came and went with alarming speed, often dying mysteriously, sometimes murdered outright. Pope Formosus, the unfortunate corpse at the center of our story, had been a controversial figure even in life. He was ambitious, politically shrewd, and deeply unpopular among his enemies. When he died in 896, those enemies weren't satisfied with letting him rest in peace. His successor, Stephen VI, had both political and personal reasons to hate him. And in medieval Rome, hatred didn't end with death. So Stephen made a choice that would echo through history. He exhumed Formosus, dressed the corpse in papal robes, sat it on a throne, and convened a court to condemn him. Now imagine being one of the cardinals summoned to this trial. You shuffle nervously into the courtroom, expecting to hear cases of heresy or disputes over land. Instead, you find yourself staring at a corpse, one you probably buried less than a year ago, now wearing papal vestments again. You glance at your colleagues, hoping someone else will object, but no one does. Everyone is too afraid of Stephen VI. The trial begins. Stephen paces the room, his voice rising, eyes flashing with rage. He points at the corpse of Formosus and demands answers. He lists charges: illegally serving as bishop of multiple cities, lying under oath, seizing power. His voice drips with fury. At one point, he grabs the corpse and shakes it, screaming accusations into its lifeless face. The corpse says nothing. Of course it doesn't. But that doesn't stop the farce from continuing. The deacon speaks when required, admitting guilt on behalf of his silent client. The court nods gravely. And gradually, this surreal pantomime begins to look, in its own way, like justice, or at least, like revenge dressed as justice. This was not a private humiliation, either. People were watching. The clergy, nobles, and citizens of Rome were present. They saw with their own eyes their pope raging at a corpse. Some must have been horrified. Others must have smirked behind their hands, barely suppressing laughter. Because the absurdity is undeniable. What is a trial for, if not to hear a defense, weigh evidence, and deliver a verdict? And what defense can a corpse possibly give? Yet here was the Pope of Rome, the highest religious authority in the West, dedicating his energy not to prayer, not to reform, but to screaming at a man who had been dead for months. And so, this is where we begin, with a courtroom unlike any other, where incense and rot mingled in the air, where solemn prayers gave way to grotesque theatre, and where a dead pope was forced to answer for sins he could no longer defend. In the next section, we'll meet this unlucky corpse in more detail. Who was Pope Formosus? Why was he so hated, even after death? And how did his enemies convince themselves that this trial of bones and rags was necessary? Before we can understand why a corpse was dragged into court, we need to understand the man behind the corpse, Pope Formosus. Because Formosus wasn't just any pope. He was one of the most controversial figures in a century already bursting with intrigue. To his enemies, he was a schemer, a liar, and an illegitimate bishop who clawed his way to the papacy. To his supporters, he was a shrewd diplomat and a steady hand in chaotic times. To us, with the benefit of hindsight, he was both, and his reputation was so divisive that it quite literally followed him into the grave. Formosus before the papacy. Formosus was born around 816 AD, in the chaos of early medieval Rome. He rose quickly in the church, eventually becoming the Bishop of Porto, one of the key suburbs of Rome. From there, he made a name for himself as a skilled negotiator, sent on important missions across Europe. He was trusted enough to act as a papal ambassador to Bulgaria and the Frankish kingdoms. That was no small feat. Diplomacy in the 9th century wasn't about shaking hands and making speeches. It was about navigating dangerous rivalries between kings, nobles, and warlords who often solved disputes with swords. Formosus proved capable, but ambition has a way of making enemies. His growing influence alarmed some in Rome. By the 870s, he was accused of harboring designs on the papacy itself. And in a city where noble families treated the papal throne like their personal prize, those accusations were deadly. Trouble with Pope John VIII. Formosus's real troubles began with Pope John VIII, one of the most paranoid and ruthless popes of the age. John suspected Formosus of plotting against him, perhaps even trying to claim the papacy. In 876, John convened a synod and dropped the hammer. Formosus was accused of abandoning his diocese, of conspiring with foreign rulers, and of seeking the papal throne by unlawful means. He was excommunicated, cut off from the church, stripped of authority. Think about that. Formosus went from trusted ambassador to church outcast almost overnight. For years, he lived under this cloud of disgrace. But politics in Rome shifted quickly. After John VIII was murdered in 882, poisoned and then beaten to death with a hammer, yes, really, his successors proved more lenient. Formosus's excommunication was lifted, and he slowly returned to favor. Formosus becomes pope in 891. After years of survival in the poisonous swamp of papal politics, Formosus finally achieved the throne he had once been accused of coveting. He was elected pope. But even then, peace was not in the cards. His papacy was marked by the same chaos that had haunted his career. Rival noble families, the Dukes of Spoleto in particular, resented his authority. The Carolingian dynasty in the north wanted his support. And Formosus, ever the diplomat, tried to juggle these alliances. He crowned a Frankish king, Arnulf of Carinthia, as Holy Roman Emperor in 896, a direct insult to the Spoltan faction, who wanted the title for themselves. That choice sealed his fate. Death of Formosus. By the spring of 896, Formosus was already in poor health. Some sources suggest he may have been poisoned, others that he simply died of natural causes after years of stress. Whatever the truth, he passed away that year and was buried quietly in St. Peter's Basilica. At least, it should have been quiet. But his enemies were not done with him. The Spoltan family, who despised him for favoring Arnulf, wanted revenge. And when one of their allies, Stephen VI, became pope the following year, that revenge turned into spectacle. Why dig up a dead pope? You might wonder, why not just smear his name, or quietly undo his decisions? Why go through the grotesque theater of putting a corpse on trial? The answer lies in legitimacy. Medieval Rome was obsessed with the idea of rightful authority. If Formosus had been pope unlawfully, then every decision he made was invalid. Every bishop he ordained, every decree he signed, even the coronation of Arnulf as emperor, all of it could be undone. So Stephen VI didn't just want to humiliate a dead man. He wanted to erase him. He wanted to strike Formosus from history, invalidate his legacy, and prove that anyone loyal to him was tainted. But, of course, the way he chose to do that was through the most absurd, macabre method imaginable, hauling the corpse out of its tomb, dressing it in papal robes, and putting it on trial. The stage is set so by 897, less than a year after Formosus's death, Rome was preparing for a trial unlike any other. A grave was opened. A body, rotting and stiff, was pulled into the light. Clergy washed and dressed it, wrapping it once more in the sacred vestments of a pope. The body was propped up on a throne, its lifeless head tilting awkwardly. The Cadaver Synod was about to begin. And in the next section, we'll enter that surreal courtroom. We'll watch Pope Stephen VI scream accusations at a corpse, while cardinals shifted nervously and a deacon was forced to answer on behalf of the dead. Because this wasn't just politics. This was theater, grotesque, terrifying, and unforgettable. It is January of 897. The Church of St. John Lateran in Rome is filled with the smell of incense, candles flicker in the cold air, and rows of clergy sit in uneasy silence. At the front of the church, a throne has been prepared. And on that throne sits not a living pope, but a corpse. Pope Formosus has been exhumed from his grave. His body is dressed once more in papal robes, the golden pallium draped across his shoulders, the tiara resting uncomfortably on his decayed head. His skin is grey, his hands withered, his jaw sagging open. To keep him upright, attendants have tied his body to the chair with cords. He leans to one side like a grotesque puppet. And across from him stands Pope Stephen VI, alive, furious, trembling with rage. The Cadaver Synod is underway. The theatre of justice, the scene has all the trappings of a legitimate trial. Bishops in attendance, clerks taking notes, an audience of nobles and clergy watching with nervous fascination. But the absurdity is impossible to ignore. The accused cannot speak. He cannot move. He cannot defend himself. And yet, Stephen insists the proceedings continue as if the corpse were guilty until proven innocent. To make it even stranger, a deacon is appointed to speak on behalf of Formosus. Imagine being that poor man. Your job is to stand in court and answer questions for a corpse. When Stephen thunders accusations, did you unlawfully seize the papacy? Did you lie under oath? Did you betray the holy canons of the church? The deacon mutters a response on behalf of the dead, "Yes, your holiness." It is grotesque pantomime, but no one dares to laugh. Stephen VI's fury Stephen VI does not treat this as theatre. To him, this is deadly serious. He paces the hall, his voice rising to a scream, veins bulging in his neck. He points at the corpse and spits with rage. Contemporary accounts suggest he worked himself into a frenzy, screaming accusations at the lifeless body as though Formosus might suddenly rise and argue back. He accuses him of abandoning his post as Bishop of Porto, of illegally seizing the papacy, of crowning Arnulf of Carinthia emperor against the will of the Spoltan faction. To the audience, it must have been surreal, the living pope raging at a dead pope, demanding justice from a body that could never answer. Horror and fascination eyewitnesses must have sat in uneasy silence. Some probably watched in morbid fascination. Others must have shifted uncomfortably, horrified at the sacrilege. Because even by medieval standards, this was blasphemy. The body of a pope was supposed to be sacred. Dressing it in robes, propping it up, and screaming at it was closer to witchcraft than justice. But Stephen had the power, and no one dared oppose him. The trial dragged on, accusations piled up, and the corpse remained silent. Only the deacon's trembling voice broke the air, speaking for the dead. The verdict, unsurprisingly, Formosus was found guilty. The court ruled that his papacy had been invalid, his actions unlawful, his authority null and void. But Stephen did not stop at a verdict. He demanded punishment. And so the grotesque theatre turned even darker. First, attendants stripped the corpse of its papal vestments, tearing off the sacred robes piece by piece until only a decayed body remained. Then, to add humiliation, they cut off the 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers used to give blessings. Imagine the scene: priests with solemn faces, carefully cutting the stiff, rotted fingers from a corpse, while Stephen looked on with grim satisfaction. Finally, the body itself was dragged from the throne and thrown to the ground. Some sources suggest it was tossed into a pauper's grave. Others say it was paraded through the streets in mockery before being dumped into the Tiber River. The message was clear: Pope Formosus was erased. His papacy was illegitimate, his legacy destroyed, his body desecrated. The audience reacts, but history rarely goes according to plan. Stephen VI may have thought this display would cement his authority. Instead, it horrified Rome. The people whispered that the trial was a curse upon the city, an act of madness that brought shame upon the papacy. Clergy muttered that it was sacrilege. And soon, popular opinion turned against Stephen himself. Within months, mobs filled the streets, demanding justice for the dead pope. Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. The corpse trial that was meant to destroy Formosus ended up destroying Stephen. The surreal legacy of the synod, the Cadaver Synod, was so bizarre, so grotesque, that later generations of popes tried to erase it from memory. Several successors annulled the verdict, declared the trial invalid, and even reburied Formosus with honor. But the stain remained. Because nothing could erase the memory of that courtroom: a rotting pope propped up like a puppet, a furious pope screaming accusations, and a church reduced to theater. This was the Cadaver Synod. Not justice, not even politics, but grotesque pageantry that shocked Europe and left a scar on the papacy for centuries. In the next section, we'll explore what happened next, how a corpse can be punished, why people thought desecrating Formosus would undo his legacy, and how the backlash against this trial changed the papacy forever. The verdict had been delivered. Pope Formosus, dead for months, propped up like a grotesque puppet, had been declared guilty. His papacy was invalid. His ordinations were null. His every act as pope was erased with a single, absurd judgment. But in the mind of Pope Stephen VI, this wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to condemn the man's memory. He wanted to punish the body. Stripping the corpse, the attendants moved forward. In silence, they began to peel away the sacred vestments that had been placed on Formosus's corpse just hours earlier. The papal pallium was stripped from his shoulders, the tiara removed from his rotting head, the embroidered robes torn away piece by piece. What had once been a solemn vesting of a pope now became a public humiliation. The message was clear: Formosus was no longer pope, not even in death. He was reduced to a corpse in rags, an object of ridicule. The fingers of blessing, but Stephen wanted more. He ordered the right hand of Formosus mutilated. Specifically, the 3 fingers used to give blessings, the index, middle, and ring finger, were cut off. In life, these fingers had been raised in sacred gestures, bestowing benedictions on the faithful. In death, they were chopped away, a symbolic silencing of his authority. Imagine the scene: the corpse, stiff and awkward, slumped in its chair, while attendants carefully hacked away at its brittle, decayed fingers. The bones snapped, the flesh tore, and in the silence of the courtroom, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, caught between horror and disbelief. It was the ultimate insult, a declaration that even in death, Formosus's hands could no longer bless, his authority could no longer extend beyond the grave. From throne to trash with the symbolic mutilation complete, Stephen ordered the body cast aside. Some accounts say it was dragged from the throne and thrown to the floor like garbage. Others claim it was stripped naked and paraded through the streets of Rome. Finally, the rotting remains were dumped into a pauper's grave. But even that wasn't the end. Later, the body was exhumed again, this time not for trial, but for disposal. It was hauled to the banks of the Tiber River and thrown unceremoniously into the current. The once holy body of a pope, a man buried in St. Peter's itself, was reduced to waste, floating down the river like trash. Horror and outrage for Stephen VI, this was victory. He had not only condemned Formosus but destroyed his body and erased his legacy. But for the people of Rome, the spectacle was too much. The Cadaver Synod was meant to prove Stephen's strength. Instead, it convinced many that he had lost his mind. Whispered rumors spread through the streets that Rome was cursed for desecrating a pope, that Stephen was possessed by demons, that the corpse of Formosus, now carried by the waters of the Tiber, would return for vengeance. And vengeance, in a way, came quickly. The backlash, the people of Rome rioted. Crowds filled the streets, demanding justice for the desecrated pope. The clergy, too, recoiled in horror at what they had been forced to witness. Stephen VI, who had hoped to solidify his rule, found himself despised and isolated. Within months of the synod, he was overthrown, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. The punishment he inflicted on Formosus seemed to rebound upon himself. It was as if the corpse had taken revenge. The strange fate of Formosus's body even stranger. The story of Formosus's body didn't end in the Tiber. According to some accounts, his corpse washed ashore downstream, where sympathetic monks recovered it. To them, he was a martyr, a pope wronged by a madman. They gave him a quiet burial. And when later popes reversed the verdict of the Cadaver Synod, Formosus was reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica, his legacy, at least officially, restored. The symbolism of punishing a dead man, but why go to such lengths? Why mutilate a corpse, strip it, and throw it in a river? In medieval thought, the body and the soul were deeply connected. Even in death, the body was seen as a vessel of identity and power. By desecrating Formosus's corpse, Stephen was trying to destroy not just his memory but his spiritual authority. Cutting off his blessing fingers was more than a gesture. It was a way of declaring his blessings invalid, his authority powerless. Throwing him in the Tiber was a way of purging him from Rome itself. It was grotesque theater, but it was also politics by other means. A curse on Rome. Ironically, the Cadaver Synod became a curse not on Formosus, but on Stephen. His reign collapsed, his name became synonymous with madness, and later popes scrambled to undo his actions. Formosus, meanwhile, emerged from the affair with a strange kind of martyrdom. Though his papacy had been controversial, the sight of his corpse humiliated and mutilated turned public opinion in his favor. His enemies destroyed his body, but in doing so, they immortalized him. And so, the punishment of a dead man, intended as an erasure, became one of the most infamous episodes in church history. But the story does not end here. In the next section, we'll explore the legacy of the Cadaver Synod, how later popes tried to erase it, how it haunted the medieval church, and why it still stands as one of the most bizarre trials in human history. The corpse was stripped. The fingers were cut. The body was thrown into the Tiber. And Pope Stephen VI had his victory. Or so he thought. Because the Cadaver Synod didn't erase Pope Formosus. It didn't silence his legacy. If anything, it did the opposite. By dragging his corpse into court, Stephen VI ensured that Formosus would be remembered forever. Not for his diplomacy, not for his papal decrees, but for the grotesque theater of his trial. The backlash against Stephen VI. Within months of the synod, Rome turned on Stephen. Crowds rioted, outraged at the desecration of a pope. The clergy muttered about sacrilege, whispering that Rome was cursed. And Stephen himself? Overthrown, imprisoned, and strangled to death by his own guards. The trial that was supposed to secure his authority destroyed him instead. It was as if Formosus had taken revenge from beyond the grave. Later popes undo the damage. Stephen's successors scrambled to distance themselves from the madness. Pope Theodore II, who reigned briefly in 897, annulled the Cadaver Synod, declaring its verdict invalid. Formosus's body, or what was left of it, was reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. A few years later, Pope John IX confirmed this annulment. He went even further, banning trials of the dead entirely. A wise move, really. Once you start digging up corpses to settle political disputes, things can only go downhill. But the memory of the Cadaver Synod refused to vanish. Even centuries later, chroniclers shook their heads in disbelief at the episode, describing it as both horrifying and absurd. A ghost at the papal throne. The legacy of Formosus haunted the papacy long after. Later popes couldn't undo the fact that one of their own had been dressed, propped, and condemned like a puppet. The image stuck. The Holy Father of Christendom, dragged through the mud, reduced to theater. It became a symbol of the corruption and chaos of the medieval papacy. a time when noble families and political factions treated the papal throne like a chess piece, and even the sacred body of a pope wasn't safe from their schemes. The symbolism of it all. Why does this story grip us so strongly? Perhaps because it is theatre in its purest, most grotesque form. Justice is meant for the living. Trials are meant to weigh words, to hear defenses, to uncover truth. The Cadaver Synod stripped all of that away and revealed what was really underneath: vengeance, power, and the human need to humiliate our enemies, even when they can't fight back. By cutting off Formosus's blessing fingers, Stephen VI thought he was erasing his power. But really, he was showing us how fragile power is, how easily it collapses into farce. Echoes in human history, and maybe that's why this story feels so bizarrely familiar. We may not put corpses on trial anymore, but we still put reputations on trial long after death. We still dig up the past, relitigate old controversies, and try to erase those we hate from memory. In that sense, Stephen VI wasn't so unusual. He was just louder, cruder, and infinitely more theatrical. Think of modern cancel culture, or the way we tear down statues, rename streets, or rewrite histories. It's the same instinct: to condemn, to erase, to make the past confess its guilt. Stephen simply took it literally, dragging bones into a courtroom, tying them to a chair, and screaming at them until he felt avenged. The most bizarre trial in history, the Cadaver Synod, remains one of the strangest episodes in human history. It has everything: political intrigue, grotesque theatre, dark humor, and the chilling image of a corpse on trial. It reminds us that history is not always noble, not always rational, not always dignified. Sometimes it is absurd. Sometimes it is petty. Sometimes it is downright grotesque. And sometimes, as in the case of the Cadaver Synod, it is all of those things at once. Closing reflection. So picture it one last time: the late Ram Basilica in 897. Candles flickering, incense swirling, a pope raging with fury, and on the throne before him, the slumped, lifeless body of his predecessor, dressed in sacred robes, condemned in silence. The Cadaver Synod didn't destroy Formosus. It immortalized him. And it left us with a story so bizarre that more than 1,000 years later, we're still shaking our heads in disbelief. Because if there's one lesson here, it's this: when the living cannot let go of their grudges, not even the dead are safe.